"Dad, I'm getting married," my daughter said excitedly over the phone. Smiling, I asked, "Who's the lucky guy?" But the instant she spoke her fiancé's name, my smile disappeared. Seconds later, his photo appeared on my screen. I froze as the blood in my veins turned ice cold. 10 years had passed, yet I had never forgotten that face. The man my daughter was about to marry was the same nightmare who had once come terrifyingly close to taking everything from me. I'm so grateful you chose to spend your time here with me today. Before I continue, tell me in the comments, what country are you from? What city are you in right now? Let's see where the Revenge Dad family reaches. This story contains some fictional elements added for entertainment and education. Names and locations are coincidental, but the message it carries is something I hope stays with you. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning, and it changed everything. I was standing at the top floor window of the Morgan Industrial Building, watching the trucks pull out of the loading yard below. Each silver logo, rolling past the iron gate, felt like reclaiming a piece of my life I had written off as gone. 40 years, 6 workers, a rented warehouse and a bank loan that had required me to sign over the first home my wife and I ever owned. We had built Morgan Industrial into one of the largest construction materials companies in the western United States. And then 10 years ago, we had nearly lost all of it. Customers walked, stock fell, banks froze our credit lines. Nearly 1,000 employees stared down the possibility of losing their jobs. I had sold most of my personal assets, cut my own salary to a symbolic figure, and worked 16-hour days just to keep the lights on. Morgan Industrial had only truly stabilized in the past year. So, on that Wednesday morning, watching those trucks move, something in my chest felt lighter than it had in a decade. My phone buzzed. Emily's name lit up the screen. "Dad." Her voice came through warm and breathless. "I'm getting married." Joy rose in my chest so fast it nearly knocked the coffee cup from my hand. My 32-year-old daughter, a corporate attorney in Los Angeles, had been through a few relationships, but she had never once mentioned marriage. "That's wonderful," I said. "Who is he?" "His name is Daniel Carter. We met at a fundraiser about 14 months ago. Dad, he's the kind of man who actually listens." My pen dropped onto the desk. Daniel Carter. I told myself it was a common name. I told myself that as my fingers found the edge of the desk and gripped it hard enough to hurt. "Send me a photo," I said. The image loaded slowly. A man in a dark navy suit, silver at his temples, a confident smile aimed at the camera. Emily was leaning into him like she had found the safest place on earth. Then I saw the scar small just below his left eyebrow, and his eyes, gray, cold. The kind that photographs usually softened but couldn't quite erase. My hand began to tremble. 10 years ago, Daniel Carter had been the director of research and development at Morgan Industrial. I had trusted him the way a man trusts a son he never had. I had given him full access to ThermoShield, 6 years and $40 million of research into a fire-resistant material that could have changed everything, and he had used that trust to steal it all. "Dad," Emily's voice came through the speaker. "Did you get the photo?" "I got it." My jaw ached from clenching. "Emily, does Daniel know you're my daughter?" "Probably. My name isn't a secret. I need you to stay away from him." The silence before she spoke told me everything. "He said you'd react this way," she said quietly. "He told me he discovered the problems with ThermoShield, that you needed someone to blame, and he was convenient." My throat tightened. He had gotten there first. "Do you have proof, Dad?" Her voice was firm. "Actual proof?" I had 10 years of certainty. I had nothing else. "I love you," Emily said, "but I can't live my life around your fears." The line went dead. Below, the last truck disappeared through the iron gate. I canceled every meeting on my calendar before 9 a.m. My assistant knocked twice, then pushed the door open with the cautious expression of someone who had worked for me long enough to recognize when I needed to be left alone. "Mr. Morgan, your 10 o'clock with the Seattle distributors." "Reschedule everything," I said. "All of it. Close the door behind you." She did without another word. I sat at my desk and pulled up the photo Emily had sent. I studied it the way I used to study contracts, line by line, detail by detail, looking for the thing that didn't belong. The scar below his left eyebrow. The gray eyes that caught the camera's light and gave nothing back. 10 years had added weight to his face and silver to his hair, but Daniel Carter had always known how to look like someone you could trust. That particular skill hadn't aged a day. My chest ached with a fury so old and so familiar, it felt like a second heartbeat. I picked up my desk phone and dialed Stephen Clark. Stephen had been my attorney for over 20 years, 69 years old, nearly all of his hair gone white, with the kind of mind that got sharper under pressure instead of dull. He had sat beside me through every deposition, every board meeting, every sleepless night of the Thermo Shield investigation. If anyone on this earth understood what Daniel Carter's reappearance meant, it was Stephen. He answered on the second ring. "Leorin, this is early for a social call." "It's not social." I forwarded the photo to his email while I spoke. "Check what I just sent you. Tell me what you see." I heard the soft clicks of his keyboard, then a long pause that stretched until my knuckles ached from gripping the receiver. "Lord Almighty," Stephen said quietly. "Is that who I think it is? Tell me I'm wrong." "You're not wrong." His voice dropped into the low, careful register he used when the situation was serious enough to require precision. "Leorin, this cannot be a coincidence. He's engaged to Emily." Another pause, longer this time. When Stephen spoke again, his voice was controlled in the way that told me he was already thinking 3 moves ahead. "When did she tell you?" "An hour ago. She called to share the good news." The bitterness in my own voice surprised me. "He's already been talking to her, Stephen." She quoted his version of Thermo Shield back to me like she'd memorized it. "He told her he was the one who discovered the problems, that I used him as a scapegoat." "Of course he did," Stephen exhaled slowly. "He's had 10 years to craft that story. And Emily, she has no memory of him from before. She was 22 when it happened. She was in law school on the East Coast. I kept her away from most of it deliberately." I pressed my fingers against my eyes until I saw color. "I thought I was protecting her." "You were," Stephen said firmly. "You couldn't have known he'd come back through her. I need Tom Baker." Already thinking it. Tom Baker was the best private investigator I had ever worked with. At 52 years old, built like a man who had spent his 20s doing something physical and never quite stopped, with a network that stretched from Los Angeles to New York, and a particular gift for following money through the dark. He had helped us during the original Thermo Shield investigation, though the legal constraints at the time had kept his hands tied. "I'll reach him within the hour," Stephen said. "Leorin, before you do anything else, you need to call Emily back." "I know. And you need to stay calm when you do it." "I know that too." I didn't tell him how difficult that was going to be. I waited until noon, then I called my daughter. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice carrying a careful neutrality that told me she had been expecting this call and had already decided how to handle it. "Dad." "Emily, I need to tell you the full story." I kept my voice level, the way you do when every instinct in your body is screaming and you can't afford to let any of it show. "Not suspicion, the actual history. Will you hear me out?" A beat of hesitation. "Go ahead." I told her everything. 6 years and $40 million poured into Thermo Shield, a fire-resistant composite material that was lighter than existing products, cheaper to produce and capable of withstanding nearly twice the heat load of industry standards. If it had launched successfully, it would have positioned Morgan Industrial at the top of the construction materials market for a generation. Daniel had been 35 when I hired him, already developing a reputation as an engineering prodigy who could read a room as well as he could read a blueprint. I had given him full access to our research servers, our testing data, our supplier relationships, and our patent filing timeline. 3 months before launch, the failures began. Testing samples that had passed every benchmark suddenly couldn't hold up under standard conditions. Data disappeared from our servers in fragments. A key supplier abruptly terminated their contract and signed with Vantage Global Materials, our largest competitor, the following week. Then came the morning we discovered that nearly 40% of our manufactured Thermo Shield inventory had failed thermal resistance thresholds. We halted production. We recalled the inventory. And before we could even begin a formal investigation, Vantage Global held a press conference to introduce a new fire-resistant material with properties nearly identical to Thermo Shield, but stable. When the internal investigation began, I told Emily every piece of digital evidence pointed at me. Server access logs under my credentials, emails from my account authorizing formula, changes I never approved, a consulting contract bearing my electronic signature, granting a third-party firm access to our technical data. "But you were cleared," Emily said. Her voice was neutral processing rather than reacting. A forensic investigator proved the access had come from a device I couldn't have used. I was at a conference in Chicago. The formula changes were made without my authorization. But the original data had been wiped, the physical devices were gone, and every financial transaction had passed through shell companies. My jaw tightened. Daniel resigned before the second subpoena was issued. He was out of the state before investigators could compel his testimony. There was not enough direct evidence to prosecute him. But Emily, he was the only person with both access and motive. The line stayed open. I could hear Emily breathing. "He told me you'd say all of this," she finally said, and the words landed in my chest like something cold and heavy. "He said the investigation cleared both of you and that you've spent 10 years looking for someone to hold responsible because you couldn't accept that the failure was a business miscalculation." My throat tightened so sharply that for a moment I couldn't speak. The audacity of it, the surgical precision with which he had preemptively dismantled every truth I might tell her, made my eyes burn with a fury that had nowhere to go. "Emily," my voice came out rougher than I intended. "I know what I know. I know what that man is capable of. And I am asking you as your father to please be careful." "Dad," her voice softened just slightly, and somehow that was worse than anger. "I love you, but Daniel has never given me a single reason to doubt him. You're asking me to throw away a relationship with someone who genuinely loves me because of something that happened 10 years ago and was never proven." She paused. "That's not fair to either of us." "Emily, I have to go." The softness hardened again. "I'll call you this weekend." The line went dead for the second time that day. I sat holding the phone long after the call ended, my chest rising and falling with the effort of containing everything I hadn't said. Through the window downtown, Los Angeles shimmered in the midday heat, indifferent and blazing, and somewhere in that city, my daughter was going home to a man who had spent 10 years engineering this exact moment. Then my cell phone buzzed with a text from Tom Baker. "We need to meet, not over the phone. There are things about Daniel Carter you don't know yet, and they're worse than what you remember." Tom Baker arrived at my house on Sunday morning, carrying a manila folder so thick it had to be held shut with 2 rubber bands. He was 52 years old, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. I had first worked with Tom during the Thermo Shield investigation, when he had spent 6 months chasing shadows that kept disappearing before he could get close enough to name them. The legal constraints back then had kept his hands tied in ways that had clearly frustrated him. He had told me when it was over that Daniel Carter was the most careful operator he had ever tracked, and Tom Baker did not give out compliments lightly. Stephen Clark was already at my kitchen table with his reading glasses on and a legal pad in front of him when Tom walked in. Outside, the October marine layer was burning off over the canyon, and the morning light came through the windows in long, flat angles that made everything look overexposed. Tom set the folder on the table and pulled off the rubber bands without ceremony. 4 days, he said. "Here's what 4 days gets you." He opened the folder and spread the contents across the table, the way a dealer lays out cards methodically, each item placed with intention. Photographs, financial records, corporate registration documents, a timeline printed on 3 pages and annotated in red ink. Daniel Carter has been living under his real name since he left California. Tom began tapping the first photograph, a surveillance image of Daniel in a charcoal overcoat, walking out of a building in Midtown Manhattan. No aliases, no identity changes. He went to New York, set up a string of small consulting firms, Nevada, Delaware, Wyoming, and has been operating out of them ever since. "What kind of consulting?" Stephen asked, his pen already moving. "The kind where money goes in and very little documentation comes out." Tom pulled a separate sheet from the stack, a list of company names with registration dates and dissolution dates beside them. Each firm operated for 3 to 8 months, received large wire transfers, then closed. He's done it 11 times in 10 years. 3 of those firms were connected to investment deals that later collapsed and left outside investors with significant losses. My stomach turned. Was he investigated, looked at, never charged? Tom's expression didn't change. He's careful. He always has a layer of legitimate paperwork between himself and the money. But here's what I want you to see. He slid a new document across the table, a corporate registration from Delaware dated 18 months ago. The company name was Green Horizon Capital. This is the firm he's been building with Emily. Stephen leaned forward and picked it up, his eyes moving fast. She mentioned this. She said she was planning to invest $8 million from her mother's trust. She told me the same thing, I said. The words felt like gravel in my mouth. Tom nodded. Green Horizon is real. It has a website, a registered address, the correct state filings. But it's connected to a parent entity called Northbridge Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. He tapped the document. Northbridge has been active since 2018, 2 years before Daniel ever introduced himself to Emily. The room felt very still. I heard the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, heard a car pass slowly on the street outside. He built the exit route before he found the entrance, Stephen said. That's exactly right. Tom reached back into the folder and pulled out a photograph that made my chest clench. A grainy image clearly shot from a distance with a long lens of Daniel standing in the lobby of a building. Emily was visible in the background, walking toward the elevators, completely unaware of him. The timestamp in the corner read 8 months before she had ever mentioned his name to me. This was taken at a charity event in Century City. He was there. She was there. He didn't approach her that night, just watched. The fury that moved through me was cold rather than hot, the kind that settles in your bones and stays. He studied her first, I said. For at least 8 months before their official meeting, Tom confirmed. He donated $50,000 to an environmental nonprofit where Emily serves as pro bono legal counsel. He leased office space in the same building as her firm, 2 floors up a different elevator bank. He attended 3 professional events where she was present. Tom paused. Then 14 months ago, he walked up to her at a fundraiser for pediatric burn victims and introduced himself. Stephen set down his pen, his hands usually so steady pressed flat against the table. She never had a chance. There's one more thing. Tom reached into the folder for the last time and produced a printed email chain and a name I didn't recognize, Vivian Santos. Emily's assistant at the firm. 38 years old, been working for Emily for 4 years. She contacted me 2 days ago, found my name in some of the old Morgan Industrial investigation materials that Emily keeps in her office. I straightened. She contacted you? Why? Because she's been watching Daniel for months and she doesn't know what to do about it. Tom tapped the email chain. Vivian has been saving copies of unusual emails sent to the firm's general inbox inquiries about California trust fund investment structures, international wire protocols, the legal thresholds for spousal co-signature requirements on managed investment accounts. All sent from different addresses, all untraceable. But Vivian cross-referenced the IP data with building access logs. He looked at me directly. Every single one of those emails originated from the office 2 floors above Emily's. The air went out of my lungs. Daniel was researching the legal mechanics of Emily's inheritance from inside the same building. Stephen said slowly, each word dropping like a stone into still water. Before he ever told her he loved her. I pushed back from the table and walked to the window. My hands found the sill and held it. Outside the canyon was gold and green in the morning sun, beautiful and completely indifferent to what was happening inside this room. I'm sending her the entire file tonight, I said. Tom's voice came from behind me, careful. Leerin, understand that she may not receive it the way you're hoping. I know. I turned around. My jaw was tight enough to ache. But I'm not going to sit here knowing what I know and say nothing. I sent the file to Emily at 9 p.m. that night. By 10:15, my phone was ringing. Her voice when I answered was not the voice of a daughter calling her father. It was the voice of someone who had just been told the person they trusted most had been investigating the man they loved without telling them, and had decided that the investigation itself was the betrayal. How could you do this? Her voice cracked at the edges, raw and disbelieving. You hired someone to follow him, Dad, to photograph him, to dig through his financial records, without telling me, without asking me. Emily, what's in that file? What's in that file is a collection of coincidences assembled by a private investigator you paid to build a case. Her voice broke higher, shaking now. Daniel told me this would happen. He said you would never accept him. He said you would do exactly this. My chest felt like something was tightening around it from the outside. He told you I would hire an investigator. He said you would try to destroy his reputation because you couldn't stand seeing me happy with someone who isn't under your control. A sound escaped her, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something broken in between. And here we are, Dad. Here we are. Emily, He was in that building 8 months before you met. He donated money to your nonprofit to get close to you. He researched your inheritance trust before he ever said your name out loud. Stop! The word came out like a door slamming. I am done listening to this. I am done. Her breathing was audible now, unsteady. Don't contact Daniel. Don't investigate him. Don't send me any more files. If you can't respect that, then I don't know how we move forward from here. The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone against my chest, the house around me so quiet I could hear the clock on the mantle ticking from the next room. Tom had been right. She had not received it the way I was hoping, but somewhere in the back of my mind, one sentence kept circling something Daniel had apparently said to her with such precision and such timing that it could only have been rehearsed. He said, "You would do exactly this." He had predicted my every move, which meant he had been watching me just as carefully as he had been watching her. Emily called back 11 minutes later. I had not moved from the kitchen. I was still standing at the counter with the phone in my hand, still hearing the echo of the line going dead, when the screen lit up with her name again. My thumb moved to answer before my brain fully caught up. I want to say something else. Her voice was different now. The sharp edge of anger had not gone away, but something underneath it had shifted, become more ragged. Like she had spent those 11 minutes pacing and talking to herself, and had arrived somewhere she hadn't intended to go. I'm not calling to apologize. I want to be clear about that. Okay, I said carefully. But I also... She stopped. I heard her exhale long and unsteady. Dad, what exactly do you think Daniel is after? Because you clearly believe this is all calculated. So calculated. So, what's the calculation? It was the first real question she had asked me in days, not a rebuttal, not a recitation of Daniel's preloaded answers. An actual question. I chose every word with the same care I used to choose words in a negotiation where the wrong syllable could end the deal. He needs access, I said, to resources and to a name. Your mother's trust is $8 million that he can move through investment structures designed to make it disappear. And the Morgan name attached to a fund mentioned in a prospectus dropped in a conversation with potential investors opens doors that his own name can't. Emily was quiet for a moment, then very carefully as though she were testing the weight of something, before putting her full foot on it. She said, "He's been helping me set up an investment fund, Green Horizon Capital. I was planning to seed it with $8 million from Mom's trust." My hand tightened on the phone. I had known this from Tom's file, but hearing her say it out loud, hearing her say Mom's trust in the same breath as Daniel Carter's scheme, made something in my chest pull tight and ache. "Has he shown you the full partnership agreement?" I asked. "Yes, we went through it together last month." "Emily, I need you to send it to Stephen tonight, not because I'm trying to build a case against Daniel, because you're a lawyer and you know that a second set of eyes on a complex financial document is not an accusation, it's due diligence. Can you do that?" Another pause, longer this time. "Fine," she said at last, "but I want you to know that I'm doing this to prove you wrong, not because I think you're right." "That's fine with me," I said, and I meant it. The agreement arrived in Stephen's email at 11:47 p.m. He called me at 6:15 the following morning, before I had finished my first cup of coffee, and the tone of his voice told me everything before he said a single word. "Leorin, sit down." I was already sitting. "Tell me." "The surface structure is clean." I could hear him turning pages real paper, not a screen the way Stephen always worked when something mattered. "Emily holds 60% of Green Horizon Capital on paper. Daniel holds 40. That looks reasonable. But buried in Section 9, subsection D, there's a managing member authority clause. Daniel has sole discretionary investment authority for the first 3 years of operation. Emily's ownership percentage is real, but her decision-making power is effectively 0 until year 4. And if she exits before then, Stephen's pause was the kind that means the next thing said will be difficult to hear. If Emily withdraws from the partnership, dissolves the fund, or, and I want you to note, this specific language experiences a change in marital status. Within the first 3 years, a liquidation fee and strategic compensation penalty are triggered. The combined total would transfer the majority of assets in the fund to Northbridge Holdings as the designated beneficiary. I set my coffee cup down very slowly on the counter. He built a divorce trap into the contract. He built a dissolution trap. Stephen corrected, his voice precise and grim. It's triggered by more than divorce. It's triggered by any exit. Which means, from the moment Emily signs this and seeds the fund with $8 million, the only way she keeps that money is if she stays in the partnership and by extension stays married to Daniel for a minimum of 3 years. And Northbridge Holdings exists to receive it. Northbridge Holdings was incorporated in the Cayman Islands in 2018, Stephen said. I've already confirmed it. It predates Emily by 4 years. This was never built for her. It was built for this moment, waiting for someone with the right combination of assets and trust and love to walk into it. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. The morning was gray and cold, the canyon below my house still wrapped in marine layer that hadn't burned off yet. My reflection looked back at me from the glass, older than I remembered and exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. How do we prove intent? I asked. We can't, not with this alone. Stephen's voice was steady. The voice of a man who had delivered bad news often enough to know how to do it without flinching. An aggressive attorney could argue every clause is standard investment fund language. The Northbridge connection is suspicious, but suspicion isn't evidence. We need something that shows Daniel knew what he was doing and planned it that way, not just a contract that could theoretically be misused. Tom is still working. Tom needs to keep working. A pause. There's something else, Leorin. The managing member clause isn't just about financial control. Under California securities law, if Daniel is the sole managing member with discretionary authority, he can use Green Horizons prospectus to solicit outside investors, and he can present Emily's name and the Morgan Family Association as part of that prospectus. If he raises additional capital under those representations without full disclosure, that's securities fraud under 15 U.S. Ostades Excind Ospareci. Section 78 Orch. The number landed in my chest like a stone. He's not just after $8 million. No, Stephen said, he's not. $8 million is seed capital. The Morgan name is what he actually needs. I'd want to know what he plans to do with the credibility that name buys him before we're done here. I thanked Stephen and ended the call. For a long moment I stood at the window with both hands braced against the sill, staring at the gray morning outside, and thinking about a man who had spent 4 years building a structure in the Cayman Islands to hold money that hadn't been stolen yet because he had been patient enough to wait for the right person to bring it to him. Then, my phone rang. I looked at the screen, an unfamiliar number, Los Angeles area code, but nothing I recognized. I answered out of instinct. Mr. Morgan. The voice was smooth and unhurried, carrying the easy confidence of someone who had never needed to rush anything because he had always been several steps ahead. I think it's time we spoke directly. Don't you, Daniel Carter? My jaw locked. My hand gripped the phone hard enough that I felt the case flex under my fingers. 10 years of anger, 10 years of legal, dead ends and sleepless nights, and watching my company bleed. And here was the voice behind all of it, calling my personal cell phone on a Monday morning, as though we were old colleagues catching up. How did you get this number? I asked. My voice came out flat and controlled, which was the only victory I had in that moment. Daniel's response was a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The same way I find out most things, Mr. Morgan. I pay attention. A brief pause, perfectly timed. I think we should meet, for Emily's sake. There's no reason this has to be adversarial. Every muscle in my body pulled tight. My teeth pressed together so hard, my jaw ached straight up into my temples. You have 48 hours to end this engagement, I said, or I will spend every resource I have making sure the truth comes out. This time the sound he made was definitely a laugh low and unbothered the laugh of a man who genuinely believed he was untouchable. Mr. Morgan, he said pleasantly, you've been trying to prove something for 10 years. How's that been working out for you? The line went dead. I stood holding the phone, my chest rising and falling with controlled, deliberate breaths. He was right that I hadn't been able to prove it for 10 years. What he didn't know was that 10 years ago, I hadn't had Rachel Thompson's full cooperation. Richard Collins living in fear in Carmel, or a private investigator who had just found a paper trail stretching back to 2018. He had called to remind me I was powerless. Instead, he had just told me exactly how confident he was, and that kind of confidence in my experience was always where the mistakes lived. Stephen's advice was simple and difficult in equal measure. Let him come, he said when I called to tell him about Daniel's phone call. If you refuse to meet, you're the obstacle. If you engage, you control the information. Let him believe he's winning. Men like Daniel Carter get careless when they think they've already won. So, when Emily called that Thursday to ask cautiously as though she expected me to say no, whether Daniel could join us for dinner on Saturday, I said yes. I spent the intervening days reminding myself that this was strategy, not surrender. Daniel arrived at my front door at 7 p.m., carrying a bottle of Chateau Margaux, Margaret's favorite, a label she had loved since the early years of our marriage when we could barely afford it and saved it for anniversaries. He held it out with a warm smile and said he had done a little research into what she had enjoyed. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. "That's very thoughtful," I said, because Stephen had told me to stay calm and because I understood that Daniel had just told me in the language of a man who communicates entirely in signals that he had studied my dead wife's preferences well enough to weaponize them at a dinner table. Emily came in from the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw him, and he crossed the room and kissed her temple and said something low that made her laugh, and I watched all of it with a smile fixed on my face that cost me more than anything I had paid for in years. Dinner was a performance. Daniel was extraordinary at it, asking thoughtful questions about Morgan Industrial's recovery, expressing admiration without flattery, deflecting any topic that might lead toward the past, with the smooth ease of a man who had rehearsed every conversation in advance. When Emily mentioned ThermoShield, he shook his head with what looked like genuine regret, and said it had been a painful time for everyone involved. He did not look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. Emily watched him with the eyes of someone who had found something rare and was still slightly afraid it might disappear. Then she excused herself to take a call in the kitchen, and the dinner table became something else entirely. Daniel set down his fork. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He simply looked at me across the candlelight with those gray eyes and said very quietly, "The company just got back on its feet. I'd hate to see another wave of bad press knock it down again." My pulse spiked, but I kept my hands flat on the table. "Is that a threat?" "It's an observation." His mouth curved slightly. "Markets are sensitive. Old headlines have a way of resurfacing at inconvenient moments. I'm sure you've thought about that." "I've thought about a great many things," I said. "Good." He picked up his fork again, unhurried as though we had been discussing the wine. "Then we understand each other." Emily came back from the kitchen, and Daniel's face transformed instantly. Warm opened the devoted partner, returning to the table. He reached for her hand and asked about her case, and she leaned into him, and I sat across from them both with my jaw aching and my mind already moving. After they left, Tom called. His voice was clipped. "There was a car parked 2 houses down for the duration of dinner. Long lens camera aimed at your front windows." A pause. "He's building a file on you, Leorin. My guess is it's insurance, something he can use to claim harassment or intimidation if you push too hard." I looked at the bottle of Margaret's wine still sitting on my counter, still unopened. "He made a mistake tonight," I said. "Did he?" "He told me exactly how confident he is." I picked up the bottle and put it in the back of the pantry where I wouldn't have to look at it. "Rachel Thompson, I want her on the server data by tomorrow morning." Tom's voice shifted, something like satisfaction moving through it. "Already ahead of you." She said 48 hours. Rachel Thompson arrived at my office on Monday morning with a rolling equipment case, a laptop that looked like it had been through a war, and the expression of someone who had not slept and did not particularly care. She was 58 years old, trim and precise, with silver hair cut short, and reading glasses perpetually pushed up onto her forehead as though she kept forgetting they were there. I had first worked with her during the original ThermoShield investigation, when she had been brought in as a forensic consultant and had spent 3 months chasing digital ghosts through server logs that someone had gone to considerable trouble to sanitize. The legal constraints at the time, the investigation was internal. The subpoenas were still being drafted. The jurisdictional questions were unresolved, had kept her from pursuing certain threads she had clearly wanted to pull. She had handed me her final report with the look of a surgeon who had been told to stop operating before the procedure was finished. She had been waiting a long time for a second chance at this particular patient. 47 hours and 12 minutes, she said, setting her laptop on my conference table without preamble. "Close enough?" Stephen was already there. Tom stood by the window with his arms crossed. I sat at the head of the table and watched Rachel open her case and begin connecting cables with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times and found conversation and interruption. "Talk me through it," I said. "I'm going to show you instead." She turned the laptop screen toward us. I've been working from the backup server image Morgan Industrial, archived during the original investigation, the one your IT team made before the forensic team came in. It was never fully analyzed because at the time the investigators were focused on the primary servers. The backup sat in cold storage. She pulled up a file directory. I found it in 12 hours. What was in it took the other 35. She clicked through several screens and stopped on a log entry highlighted in yellow. A string of alphanumeric characters ran across the top of the screen, a device identifier. This is the device that connected to your research server at 11:42 p.m. on the night the Thermo Shield data was exfiltrated, Rachel said. The identifier is 7F2A-9C-4471. Your company's hardware procurement records, which I cross-referenced with the backup, show that this specific device, an encrypted external storage drive, was issued to one person. She looked at me over the top of her laptop. Daniel Carter, signed out on a Tuesday in March of 2014, never returned. The room was very still. Can that identifier be spoofed? Stephen asked. His pen was moving. Theoretically, practically in 2014 with the encryption architecture Morgan Industrial was using. No. Rachel was already pulling up the next screen. But I didn't stop there because a device identifier alone without the physical drive can be challenged in court. So I traced where the device went after it connected to your server. She brought up a second log network connection, records timestamps running down the left side of the screen. At 12:19 a.m., 37 minutes after the server connection, the same device identifier appeared on a Wi-Fi network. She zoomed in on a line of data. The network belonged to the Airside Marriott near Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. Room 417. She paused. Hotel records, which are archived for 7 years, and which Tom's contact obtained through a formal records request, show that room 417 was registered that night to a Richard Collins. At the time, Richard Collins was the chief financial officer of Vantage Global Materials. Tom uncrossed his arms. Daniel walked out of Morgan Industrial with your data and handed it to Vantage's CFO in an airport hotel room, same night. Within the same hour, Rachel said. I pressed the heels of my hands against the edge of the table. My chest felt like something was compressing it from the inside, not panic, but the particular physical weight of a truth you have carried for 10 years, finally being confirmed out loud by someone other than yourself. There's one more thing. Rachel's voice stayed level, but something in her eyes had shifted the look of a professional who knew she was about to deliver the most significant finding. When I was reconstructing the deleted file directory, I found a fragment of a document that had been created on the Morgan Industrial server and subsequently wiped. I was able to recover 63% of it using sector analysis. She pulled up a new screen, a partially reconstructed document blocks of missing text replaced with gray bars. It's a draft email composed from an account under your credentials, Mr. Morgan, the kind of email that would later appear as evidence of your authorizing the formula changes. He created the fake evidence on our own server, Stephen said. He created it, wiped it, and left just enough metadata for someone to find the finished version in your sent folder. Rachel took off her reading glasses entirely and set them on the table. But here's what he missed. The document fragment carries a creation timestamp and a software build signature. The timestamp shows it was created at 9:14 p.m., 2 hours and 28 minutes, before the server login under your credentials that supposedly authorized the changes. She looked directly at me. More importantly, the software build signature doesn't match any version of the document editing software installed on your company's machines. It matches a version installed on a laptop registered to a Delaware LLC called Meridian Advisory Group. Tom was already on his phone. I'll have a registration search on Meridian Advisory Group in 20 minutes. Save yourself the time, Rachel said. I already ran it. Meridian Advisory Group was incorporated in Delaware 14 weeks before Daniel Carter submitted his employment application to Morgan Industrial. She closed the laptop with a quiet final click. He built the forgery tools before he walked through your door. The silence in the room was the kind that follows something large and irreversible. I pushed back from the table slowly and walked to the window. Outside, Los Angeles was doing what it always did, moving loud, indifferent, full of people going about their lives, without any idea that in a conference room, 20 stories above them, a decade of injustice had just acquired a spine. Richard Collins, I said. He's in Carmel by the Sea, Tom said. Retired 3 years ago, when Vantage changed leadership. From what I can find, he hasn't spoken publicly about anything related to Thermo Shield since the investigation closed. He paused. But Leor and Vantage just got acquired. New ownership. They've retained an outside firm to review all major transactions from the previous decade. I turned around from the window. My jaw was set. My hands were steady for the first time in days. Then Richard Collins just ran out of people to hide behind. I said, "Stephen, clear your Thursday. We're driving to Carmel." The drive up Highway 1 took 3 hours and 20 minutes, and Stephen and I spent most of it not talking about Richard Collins. We talked about the weather coming in off the Pacific. We talked about a case Stephen had handled in 1987 that had required a similar drive to a similar coastal town to find a similar man who had similar reasons to keep his mouth shut. We talked about Margaret the way she used to insist on stopping at a bakery in San Luis Obispo whenever we drove north, the specific table she always chose by the window, the way she ordered the same almond croissant every single time and acted surprised when it was good. I needed to talk about Margaret. I needed to remember what I was doing this for. Richard Collins lived in a gray shingled house 3 blocks from the water. The garden was overgrown in the way of someone who had once cared about it and stopped. I rang the bell and heard footsteps almost immediately too quickly, as though he had been standing near the door. When he opened it, my first thought was that 10 years had not been kind to him. He was 71 years old with white hair that had thinned to almost nothing on top, and the pallor of a man who spent most of his time indoors. His eyes moved from my face to Stephen's and back again, with the rapid calculation of someone assessing a threat. He was wearing a cardigan with a coffee stain on the left sleeve, and his hands, when they gripped the door frame, were not entirely steady. "Mr. Morgan," he said, not a greeting, a statement of fact, like a man reading his own indictment. "Mr. Collins," I said, "we'd like to talk. I have nothing to say to you." His voice was flat rehearsed. "Whatever you think I know, you were in room 417 of the Airside Marriott near Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport on March 14th, 2014. Stephen said, his voice completely pleasant, completely conversational. "Between 12:19 and 2:40 a.m. We have the hotel records and the network logs to confirm it." Richard's grip on the doorframe tightened until his knuckles went pale. "I'd like you to leave," he said. Stephen reached into his briefcase and placed 3 items on the porch railing, not aggressively, just setting them down. A photograph of the 847 Morgan Industrial employees at the company picnic 2 years before the collapse. A printed news article from 2016 with the headline reading, "Morgan Industrial Closure Leaves Hundreds Jobless in Riverside County," and a photograph of Margaret from her last Christmas 6 months before the stroke. "We're not here to threaten you, Mr. Collins," Stephen said. "We're here because a man who destroyed this family is currently engaged to Mr. Morgan's daughter, and he's going to do it again, to her." Richard looked at the photographs for a long time. His jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, but the cousin of it, the kind of pain that comes from having made a decision a long time ago and having lived inside the consequences ever since. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "Get off my porch." We drove back down Highway 1 in the late afternoon light without discussing what had happened. There was nothing useful to say. A man who had spent 10 years building walls didn't knock them down in an afternoon. My phone buzzed somewhere outside of Morro Bay. Tom, Vantage's new ownership group, sent formal correspondence to all former senior executives this week. They're requiring signatures on an indemnification waiver, full release of any corporate liability coverage for actions taken before the acquisition. Anyone who signs gives up their legal protection. Anyone who doesn't becomes a person of interest in the new ownership's internal review. I read the message twice. Then I understood. Richard Collins had spent 10 years protected by Vantage Global's legal umbrella. Vantage had every reason to keep him quiet and every resource to do it, but Vantage didn't exist anymore, not the Vantage that had made those promises. The new ownership wanted a clean slate, and a clean slate meant examining every dark corner of the previous decade, with or without Richard's cooperation. He wasn't choosing between talking to us and staying silent anymore. He was choosing between talking to us and facing an internal investigation alone, without counsel, without protection, at 71 years old. My phone rang at 6:40 the following morning, a Carmel area code. Richard Collins' voice when I answered had lost the rehearsed flatness of the day before. What was left sounded like a man who had not slept and had arrived in the small hours of the night at the only door still open to him. "Mr. Morgan," he said, "bring your attorney, and bring someone who can talk to the FBI. Before I reveal what Richard finally told us, what he had been hiding for 10 years, drop a 8 in the comments, so I know you're still with me. What you're about to hear changed everything. Just a heads up, some details in the stories ahead have been shaped for deeper impact and reflection. If that's not something you're comfortable with, it's completely okay to step away, no hard feelings at all." Richard Collins had set the table for 3. Not coffee this time, a proper breakfast, eggs and toast and orange juice in a glass pitcher, the kind of meal a man prepares when he has decided to do something he has been putting off for a very long time and wants to mark the occasion with some small formality. He was wearing a clean shirt. His hands were steadier than they had been 2 days ago, though not by much. He did not greet us at the door. He left it open and went back to the kitchen, and when Stephen and I came inside and sat down at the table, he brought the coffee pot and filled all 3 cups before he sat across from us and folded his hands and looked at me directly for the first time since we had met. "The Advantage sent the waiver by courier yesterday afternoon," he said. "I have until the end of the month to sign or decline." He paused. "I've spent the last 10 years telling myself that what I knew wasn't my responsibility, that I hadn't pulled the trigger, only held the door open." His jaw tightened. "That's a very comfortable story until someone sends you a document that makes it clear you're on your own." "Mr. Collins," Stephen said carefully, "before you say anything further, I want to be clear about what we can and cannot offer. I am Mr. Morgan's attorney, not yours. Whatever you tell us today, I cannot protect. But if you're willing to cooperate with federal investigators, I can connect you with someone who can negotiate on your behalf." Richard nodded once. "I understand." He reached into the pocket of his cardigan and placed a USB drive on the table between us. "Everything I'm about to tell you is on here. Contracts, wire transfer records, email chains. I've been keeping it for 10 years in a deposit box in Monterey." He looked at the drive for a moment, as though he were saying goodbye to something. "I kept it because I was afraid of Daniel, and because some part of me knew that one day I would need it." He began to talk. Vantage Global had paid Daniel Carter $18 million for the Thermo Shield data, not in a single transfer, but routed through 3 shell companies across a 6-month period, each transaction structured to fall below federal reporting thresholds. Richard had personally approved the first disbursement of $4 million. He had told himself it was a competitive intelligence acquisition, the kind of gray area transaction that happened in every industry if you looked closely enough. He had told himself this for approximately 3 weeks before he understood fully and without the comfort of ambiguity exactly what he had participated in. "Daniel didn't just sell you the formula," Richard said. His voice had gone flat at the voice of a man reciting something he had memorized against his will. "He altered the production ratios on Morgan Industrial's manufacturing line before he left, deliberately. The changes were small enough that they wouldn't show up in initial quality checks, but under sustained thermal load, the material would fail." He looked at his coffee cup. Vantage needed Morgan Industrial's version to fail publicly. That was the arrangement. Daniel delivered both the formula and the sabotage. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Pacific moved against the rocks below the bluff, with a sound like slow breathing. "The formula Vantage brought to market," Stephen said, "it was Thermo Shield. That stabilized with Morgan's original ratios, the ones Daniel gave us." Richard's voice didn't waver, but his hands around his coffee cup had gone white at the knuckles. "We filed the international patents 3 weeks before Morgan Industrial's public collapse. By the time your investigators started asking questions, we had legal standing in 7 markets. I had known this. I had known it the way you know something that you cannot prove in your bones, in the place behind your sternum where certainty lives regardless of what the evidence says. Hearing it spoken out loud by the man who had signed the checks did not feel like vindication. It felt like a door opening onto a room I had always known was there, finely lit from inside. Then Richard reached across the table and turned the USB drive so it faced me. "There's one more thing," he said. "In the email chain, the original thread between Daniel and myself from the beginning of the arrangement, there is a message he sent me in early 2018. He stopped. Something crossed his face that was not quite shame and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. It was sent 4 days after your wife was first hospitalized." My hands went very still on the table. Richard met my eyes. He did not look away. The message said, and I am telling you the exact words because I have read them enough times that I know them, it said, "Pressure is working. He'll be too distracted to fight back. Move the timeline up." The room tilted slightly. Not physically, the table was solid under my hands. The chair was solid beneath me, but something in my perception shifted the way it does when the ground you have been standing on turns out to be built on something else entirely. Daniel had known that Margaret's illness was weakening me. He had used it. He had written those words in an email to another man and sent them as casually as a scheduling update. And then he had accelerated his timeline because a woman's deteriorating health was to him a logistical convenience. My eyes burned. I pressed my fist against my mouth and breathed through my nose, and did not let what was happening in my chest reach my face because Richard Collins was still watching me and I needed him to keep talking. He received a share of Vantage's subsidiary after the transaction was complete. Richard continued, his voice lower now. Structured as a consulting retainer through one of his Delaware companies, the total value at the time was approximately $9 million in equity. Richard, my voice when it came out was steadier than I had any right to expect. The USB drive is the chain of custody intact dates, signatures, original file metadata. Everything. He slid it across the table. I never altered a single document. I was too afraid to touch any of it. Stephen picked it up. His hand, I noticed, was not entirely steady either. I stood and walked to the kitchen window. The ocean was gray and enormous, and completely indifferent the way oceans always are, and I stood there until I was reasonably certain I could turn around without my face telling Richard Collins more than I wanted him to see. When I turned back, I said, "You'll cooperate. Full cooperation, FBI, federal prosecutors, everything they ask." Richard nodded. He looked for the first time since we had arrived like a man who had set down something very heavy and was not sure his legs still worked properly. "Call your personal attorney today," Stephen told him. "I'll have Special Agent Michael Harris from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Los Angeles reach out to them by end of business. We do this by the book, Mr. Collins. Every step documented, every agreement in writing." I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. My hands were steady. My chest was not. "One question," I said, stopping at the kitchen door. "When you saw those photographs, the employees, the news article, the photograph of my wife, why didn't you call us then?" Richard looked at his coffee cup. A long moment passed. "Because," he said quietly, "I was still hoping someone else would fix it. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit occupied the 14th floor of the Wilshire Federal Building, and Special Agent Michael Harris's office looked exactly like the office of a man who had spent 20 years untangling other people's worst decisions, paperwork stacked in precise columns, a whiteboard covered in names and arrows and account numbers, and a desk so clean in the center that it was clearly the only surface he actually trusted. Harris was 48 years old, lean and dark-haired, with the beginning of gray at his temples, wearing a jacket that fit well enough to suggest he had bought it when he still cared about that kind of thing. He shook my hand with a grip that was firm, without being performative, looked me in the eye for exactly long enough to form an opinion, and then sat down and opened a folder that was considerably thicker than the one Tom had brought to my house the previous week. "Mr. Morgan," he said, "you've had a productive few days." "Rachel Thompson and Tom Baker did most of the work," I said. "I know. I've already spoken with both of them." Harris flipped the folder open and turned it so Stephen and I could see the first page, a financial network diagram, nodes and lines and account numbers spreading across the page like something that had grown in the dark. "I want to show you what we've been looking at on our end because what you've found and what we've found are two halves of the same picture." He walked us through it with the efficiency of someone who explained complex financial crime for a living and had learned to do it without losing his audience. Northbridge Holdings had been receiving wire transfers for 3 years, not just from Daniel's various consulting firms, but from accounts connected to former Vantage Global executives restructured through a series of intermediary entities in the Channel Islands and Cayman. The pattern was consistent and deliberate money moving in irregular amounts at irregular intervals, specifically designed to avoid triggering automated monitoring systems. "What's the destination?" Stephen asked. 3 technology companies, Harris said. 2 in California, 1 in New York, all operating in the clean energy space, all holding significant patent portfolios. He looked at me directly. Daniel's plan is to use Emily's $8 million as seed capital leverage, the Morgan family name, to raise an additional $20 million from outside investors through Green Horizons prospectus, which would constitute securities fraud under 15 U.S.C. Section 78J, given that the name is being used without full disclosure of his role and then purchase controlling interests in all three companies. And once he controls them, I asked, the patents get transferred to a foreign holding entity at below market valuation. The companies become shells. The investors lose everything. Harris closed the folder. We've seen this model before. It's the same structure he used with Thermo Shield scaled up. The total value in play is somewhere between $50 and $60 million. The number sat in the room like something with weight. Then arrest him, I said. Today, before the wedding. Harris held my gaze without flinching. I understand why you want that, Mr. Morgan. But if we move now, his attorneys will argue that every document he's prepared is a proposal, not a crime. The Northbridge structure is suspicious, but suspicion isn't prosecution. Green Horizon exists, but Emily hasn't signed anything irreversible yet. He leaned forward slightly. We need him to activate the transaction, to move the money, to change the beneficiary to Northbridge himself on camera with witnesses. That's the difference between a case that holds and a case that gets dismissed. My jaw tightened until I could feel the tension all the way up into my temples. You're asking me to let my daughter walk down that aisle. I'm asking you to let us do our jobs so that he never does this to anyone else. Harris's voice was even not unkind. There's something else I want you to understand. Under California Family Code, Section 2210, subsection D, a marriage obtained through fraud can be annulled completely, voided not divorced. Emily would have no lasting legal obligation to Daniel from this marriage. And under 18 U.S.C. Section 1345, the moment the wire transfer is initiated, we can freeze every account in the chain within hours. The $8 million does not leave the country. You're certain, I said. The legal mechanism exists and we've used it, Harris said. I'm not certain about every variable, Mr. Morgan, because I don't deal in certainties, but I am confident in this plan. I looked at the financial network diagram still spread open on the desk, all those lines connecting all those accounts, a decade of patience and calculation rendered in ink on paper. Somewhere on the other side of the diagram was my daughter, who was currently planning a wedding with a man who had written, "Pressure is working," in an email 4 days after her mother was hospitalized. I need tonight, I said. Harris nodded. Take the weekend. I called Emily on Saturday morning and listened to her talk about venue centerpieces for 4 minutes, without hearing a word she said. And I thought about Margaret in the bakery in San Luis Obispo, ordering the same almond croissant and acting surprised when it was good. And I thought about a USB drive sitting in Stephen's safe with $18 million of evidence on it, and I thought about what Rachel had said. He built the forgery tools before he walked through your door. When Emily finished talking about centerpieces, she said, "Dad, are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. My voice came out even. "Emily, I love you. Whatever happens, I need you to know that." A pause. "You're scaring me a little. Don't be scared." I pressed my free hand flat against the desk to keep it steady. "Just know that I'm always in your corner, no matter what." After I ended the call, I sat in Margaret's reading room for a long time. On the shelf beside her chair, I could see the spine of a small blue notebook I had found there months ago. Her handwriting on the cover, 2 initials and a period DC. I had seen that notebook for years without touching it. Margaret kept many notebooks, gardening records, reading lists, notes from books she loved, and I had told myself this one was no different, but I had known from the moment I saw those 2 initials on the cover that it was. I had not been ready to know what was inside. The night I finally opened it, I read the first 3 pages before my hands started shaking too badly to hold it. Then I closed it and put it back on the shelf and had not opened it again. I reached for it now. I turned to the page where I had stopped. Margaret's handwriting moved across the porf in her precise, unhurried way. And what she had written observation after careful observation about a man who had sat at our dinner table and smiled and helped himself to second servings made the back of my throat ache with the particular grief of being right about something too late. I called Harris at 9 p.m. "I'm in," I said. I stayed in Margaret's reading room until 2 in the morning. The blue notebook was open on my lap, and I had read every page of it twice by the time the house went fully quiet around me. Margaret's observations about Daniel were precise and methodical in the way that everything she wrote was precise and methodical, dated entries, specific details, no editorializing. She had noted the questions he asked that were slightly too specific about security protocols. She had noted the way he positioned himself between layering and information during meetings, subtly in ways that looked like efficiency. She had noted that he never left documents on his desk overnight, not once in 8 months, which she found unusual for a man who projected such confident carelessness in every other aspect of his work. On the last page she had written in her careful hand, "Leorin will not believe me now, because he trusts this man the way he trusted the bank that gave us our first loan completely because it worked out that time. I will keep watching." Below that, the page was blank. She had stopped there, and I did not know why, and I never would. I closed the notebook and sat with it against my chest for a long time, feeling the particular grief of a man who had been loved by someone smarter than himself and had not always known it when it was happening. Then I set the notebook on her chair where she used to sit to read, and I went to my office and called Harris and told him I was in. And after I hung up, I sat at my desk until the sky outside began to lighten, and I had the general shape of what the next several weeks would require. The 3 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, stranger even than the investigation years, because at least during the investigation I had been allowed to be angry openly. Now, I sat in meetings and answered emails and approved production schedules and had dinner with my CFO on a Tuesday. And all the while, I was carrying something no one in the room could see. Tom coordinated with Harris's team. Rachel continued working from her San Francisco office, pulling additional data threads that the FBI's own forensic team was cross-referencing. Stephen prepared the federal documentation in sealed sessions that his paralegal staff knew nothing about a precaution Harris had specifically requested after we identified the gap that Daniel had previously exploited. Vivian Santos contacted Tom in the second week. She had been holding something back. She said not from distrust, but because she hadn't been certain it was significant. She had found buried in the firm's general inbox archive a series of emails sent from rotating anonymous addresses over a 14-month period. Each one inquired about specific legal mechanisms, trust fund disbursement protocols under California law, the co-signature requirements for managed investment accounts, the process for contesting a beneficiary designation after a death. Tom cross-referenced the IP metadata. Every single email had originated from the same building as Emily's firm. Every one of them had been sent between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays. He was researching how to take her inheritance while sitting 2 floors above her office, Tom told me, for 14 months before he ever said her name out loud. I pressed my knuckles against my mouth and breathed until the fury passed enough to respond. Does Emily know Vivian is in contact with us? No, Vivian specifically asked that she not be told. She's afraid Daniel has people watching Emily's communications. Smart woman, I thought. Terrifyingly, this meant Daniel might be more careful than even we had accounted for. The letter arrived on a Thursday, or rather, Emily called me on a Thursday evening, and from the way her voice sounded when I answered, I knew before she said a word that something had shifted dramatically in a direction I was not going to like. "Dad," her voice was thick, unsteady the way it got when she had been crying and had spent time convincing herself to stop before making a call. "Daniel showed me something today. A letter." My chest went cold. "What kind of letter?" "From Mom." A sound escaped her somewhere between a breath and a sob. She wrote about you, about the company, about how she felt during the ThermoShield years." Emily's voice broke at the edges, raw and painful. "Dad, she wrote that she was disappointed in you, that you chose the company over the family, that she hoped I would have the courage to build my own life, even if you couldn't accept it." Every nerve in my body fired at once. I knew Margaret's handwriting with the same certainty I knew the sound of her voice, the slight leftward lean of her capital letters, the way her lowercase g curved back on itself, the particular pressure she applied to a pen when she was choosing words carefully. I had read 50 pages of it 2 weeks ago in the blue notebook. I knew with absolute and unshakable certainty that she had never written what Emily was describing. Daniel had forged it. He had forged a letter from my dead wife and handed it to my daughter to read. The rage that moved through me in that moment was unlike anything I had felt before, not the cold analytical fury of the investigation, not the hot grief of reading the email about Margaret's hospitalization, but something older and more fundamental the kind of anger that comes from watching someone reach into a grave. I pressed my free hand against the desk so hard the edge cut into my palm. I needed the pain to stay in the room, to stay in my body, to not let what was happening in my chest come through the phone. "Emily," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Your mother loved me. She was frustrated with me during those years. That's true, she told me so directly because that's who she was. But she never stopped believing in me, not once. I know that as certainly as I know anything." "How can you know that?" Emily's voice cracked. "How can you sit there and tell me what she felt when she's not here to—" She stopped. I heard her breathing ragged and uneven. "She wrote it, Dad. It's her handwriting. Daniel had it authenticated." He had forged the handwriting too. Of course he had. He had access to documents bearing her signature, legal papers, letters, anything that had passed through Morgan Industrial's records over the years. He'd had 10 years, and unlimited patience, and the specific surgical cruelty of a man who understood exactly which wounds don't close. I could not tell Emily the letter was forged. Not tonight, not yet, because if she confronted Daniel, he would know the investigation was closer than he thought, and he would run, and Harris had been explicit. We needed him to stay to feel safe to arrive at Beverly Wilshire, believing he was still in control of every variable. So, I said the only true thing I could say. Stephen caught my eye across the room and shook his head once, barely a movement, but I understood it. Not yet. I breathed out through my nose and chose the only words I could offer without breaking everything open. "Emily," I said, "your mother spent 38 years choosing me every single day, including the hardest ones. That's not something a letter can undo. Hold on to what you know." It was not enough. I knew it wasn't enough, but it was what I had. Emily was crying now, not the controlled, restrained sound from earlier, but something that came from deeper, from the place where a daughter keeps her grief for her mother. It took everything I had not to tell her the truth. "I need some time," she finally said. "Take whatever you need," I told her. 4 days later, she called back. Her voice had gone from grief to something harder and quieter, and before I could say hello, she said, "If you don't stop whatever you're doing to undermine this relationship, I don't want you at the wedding. I don't want you anywhere near it." I held the phone against my ear and stared at the wall of my office and felt the full weight of what I had agreed to carry. "Okay," I said quietly. "Okay." Her voice tilted, surprised. "I heard you." I reached into my vest pocket and touched the small velvet box I had put there that morning. The box with Margaret's necklace inside, the one she had always said she wanted Emily to wear on a day that mattered. "I love you, Emily. That doesn't change based on whether I'm invited." She hung up without responding. I set the phone down. I did not move for a long time. Then I picked up my cell and dialed Richard Collins. "It's time," I said when he answered. "I need you to wear a wire." Tom flew to New York with Richard Collins on a Tuesday. I stayed in Los Angeles because Harris had been specific Leor and Morgan anywhere within 300 miles of Daniel Carter in the days before the operation was a variable he did not want to manage. So, I sat in my office on the 14th floor of the Morgan Industrial Building and watched the trucks move through the loading yard below and waited, which was the hardest thing I had done in a decade that had contained a remarkable number of hard things. The plan was straightforward in the way that plans are before they meet reality. Richard would intact Daniel under the pretext of needing to discuss the Vantage acquisition and its potential exposure to their previous arrangement. He would suggest a private lunch somewhere quiet, somewhere Daniel chose, because letting Daniel choose the location would make him feel in control. Richard would wear a recording device provided by Harris's team, small enough that it sat beneath his collar without detection. Tom would be in the restaurant 2 tables away, with an earpiece connecting him to a monitoring van parked outside. Harris would be in the van. I would be connected to the earpiece feed from my office in Los Angeles, listening through a secure line, which meant I would hear everything in real time and be able to do absolutely nothing about any of it. Daniel chose a restaurant in Midtown, a dark paneled place near Rockefeller Center, that catered to the kind of business lunch where the wine list matters and the booths are deep enough that conversations don't carry. The kind of place a careful man chooses when he wants to be seen having a normal meal with an old colleague. Tom called me from outside the restaurant at 12:43 p.m. "Richard's going in," he said. "He looks good. Steady." "How steady?" "It's steadier than I expected." A pause. His hands were shaking in the car. By the time we got out, they weren't. Some people get calm when they finally decide. I understood that. I had felt it myself the night I called Harris. The feed connected 7 minutes later. I heard restaurant sounds, first cutlery low, conversation, the particular acoustic texture of a room full of people eating, and then Richard's voice asking for still water, and then Daniel's voice, and the sound of it moved through me like ice water dropped from a height. He sounded exactly the same, 10 years, and his voice carried the same easy confidence it had carried across my conference table when he was 35, and I thought I had found the future of my company. Richard! Warmth in his voice, genuine sounding, the kind you couldn't manufacture unless you'd practiced. It's good to see you. You look well. I've been better, Richard said. His voice was level, rehearsed, but not obviously so. The acquisition has created some complications. I heard. Daniel's tone shifted slightly, not to concern, but to the attentive neutrality of a man taking inventory. How exposed do you feel? Depends on what they find, Richard said, and what connections they make. A pause, the sound of a menu being set down. Richard, Daniel said, and the warmth was gone, now replaced by something quieter and more precise. Nothing connects to you that doesn't also connect to people who are no longer available to confirm it. You know that. The hotel record connects to me, Richard said. Another pause, shorter this time. That was 10 years ago, Daniel said, and it connects you to a business meeting, nothing more. There's no transaction in your name, there's no signature, there's nothing that says you knew what the meeting was for. He paused again. Do you know what the meeting was for Richard? As far as anyone can prove, it was a masterclass in how to remind someone of their complicity without explicitly confirming your own. I pressed my fist against my mouth and listened. I know what I approved, Richard said. You approved a competitive intelligence acquisition, Daniel said. That's what the documentation shows. What happened with that intelligence after it left your hands wasn't your department. A brief pause, the sound of a glass being set down. You're fine, Richard. You're 69 years old, and you live by the ocean, and nobody is looking at you. They might be soon, Richard said. Then be boring, Daniel said pleasantly. Be retired, be a man who signed some paperwork a decade ago and doesn't remember the details. A beat. That's all you've ever had to be. Richard let the pause breathe the way Tom had coached him. Not too long, not too short. Then he said, I heard Morgan's daughter is getting married. The quality of Daniel's attention changed. I could hear it even through a feed from 3,000 miles away. A slight shift, a recalibration the way a chess player's breathing changes when the conversation moves to the board. She is, he said. To you, Richard said. To me. And now there was something in his voice that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction, but lived in that neighborhood the sound of a man surveying something he built. After a great deal of patience. How much patience? About 4 years if you count from when I first started looking at the family. He said it the way you describe a long commute, mildly inconvenient, entirely worth it. The daughter was the variable I hadn't accounted for in the original plan. She turned out to be the better angle. My jaw had locked so tightly that I could feel the tension in my ears. And Morgan, Richard asked. He knows who you are. He knows who I was, Daniel said. He has a file and a theory, and 10 years of not being able to do anything with either. A pause and then something that made the hair on my arms stand up, a low sound, almost amused, entirely confident. He'll make noise. He always makes noise. But noise isn't evidence, and I've had a long time to make sure there isn't any. He paused. The daughter signs the night of the wedding. By morning, the transfer is complete, and the structure is closed. After that, it doesn't matter what Morgan thinks he knows. Then Daniel's voice dropped slightly, and what he said next was said in the tone of a man sharing something he found genuinely interesting rather than alarming. Someone told him I was looking into the family, he said. Some paralegals, apparently, got into a file she shouldn't have had access to. He clicked his tongue once. Amateur hour, but it tells me he's been making calls, asking questions. A brief pause. I've prepared for that. In the monitoring van outside, Harris was already on a second line. In my office in Los Angeles, I was very still, because Daniel Carter had just told me, with total confidence and no apparent concern, that he believed he was untouchable, and the specific quality of that confidence was the most useful thing I had heard in 10 years, because it meant he had not considered the possibility that Richard Collins was currently recording every word. Tom's voice came through my earpiece 30 seconds later, barely above a murmur. We have it, he said. Every word. I pressed my hand flat on the desk in front of me. My fingers were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the particular physical release of something held under enormous pressure for a very long time. "Tell Harris," I said, "that I want to know the moment he's ready to move." Harris arrived at Stephen's office at 7 in the morning without calling ahead. I was already there. I had been there since 6:15, which was when Tom's flight from JFK landed, and he had come directly from LAX with the recording on a secured drive and dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had not slept on the plane. Stephen had made coffee. Nobody had touched it. Harris set his jacket over the back of a chair, sat down and opened his laptop without ceremony. "The paralegal," he said. "Her name is Claire Weston, 26 years old, been with the firm 8 months. Last Tuesday, a man came in through the building's main entrance, claiming to be from a cybersecurity firm doing a routine compliance audit. He had a badge, a clipboard, and a name that matched a real company." Harris turned the laptop so we could see the lobby security footage, a man in a gray jacket, baseball cap, pulled low, moving through the reception area with the comfortable authority of someone who belonged there. He asked Claire to pull up the active client roster for a cross-reference check. She complied. The roster included the Morgan Industrial file. "Daniel sent someone," Tom said. "We believe so. The cybersecurity firm confirmed they sent nobody to that building that day. The name on the badge was a real employee, one who had left the company 6 months ago." Harris closed the laptop. "Claire made a mistake. She's not a spy. She's a 26-year-old who followed what looked like protocol. Daniel exploited a gap in the firm's visitor verification process." Stephen removed his glasses and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. "What does he know? He knows Leorin is building a case and has legal representation actively involved. He doesn't know about the FBI, about Richard's cooperation, or about the recording we made yesterday." Harris looked at me directly. "Which means he's more careful than before, but not careful enough to run. He still believes he controls the timeline." "Good," I said. "Let him keep believing that." Harris nodded. "From this point, all communication goes through encrypted channels only. The paralegal has been quietly reassigned to a different project. No explanation given, nothing that would signal a security concern was identified." He closed his notebook. "We let the gap stay visible. If Daniel checks again, he finds what he found before and nothing more." After Harris left, Tom and I sat in Stephen's office and went over the recording 3 more times. Each time I heard Daniel's voice saying, "The daughter was the variable I hadn't accounted for." Something tightened in the center of my chest and stayed tight long after the recording ended. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. I pulled over to read it. "Mr. Morgan, this is Vivian Santos. I'm texting from a personal phone because I don't trust my work device right now. Emily has been asking me questions about the Green Horizon contract, specifically about Northbridge Holdings. I told her I didn't know, but she's been in her office with the door closed for 2 hours, and she pulled the original agreement out of the filing cabinet this morning. I think she's reading it again. V. I read the message twice. Then I called Tom. "Vivian just texted me," I said. "Emily is rereading the Green Horizon contract. She's asking about Northbridge." A pause on Tom's end. "That's either very good or very complicated." "Why complicated?" "Because if she finds something in that contract that bothers her enough to ask Daniel directly, he'll know something shifted. And if he thinks she's starting to pull at the thread..." Tom stopped. "He might accelerate, or he might double down on the manipulation and convince her she's being paranoid," I said. "He's done it before. Either way, we need to know which direction he goes." Tom paused. "I'll ask Vivian to keep watching, carefully, nothing that could flag." I ended the call and sat in my parked car on a residential street in Brentwood, staring at the middle distance, feeling the particular helplessness of a man who can see exactly what is about to happen to someone he loves and has chosen for reasons that are correct and rational, and that he believes in fully to let it happen. Emily called me that evening. Not about the contract, not about Northbridge. She called to tell me that the florist had confirmed the centerpiece arrangement she had chosen for the reception, and that the weather forecast for the wedding weekend was looking clear, and that she had found a photographer whose work she loved. She talked for 11 minutes about a wedding I was not invited to attend. I listened to every word. I asked questions. What were the centerpieces? What did the photographer's portfolio look like? Was the venue indoor or outdoor for the ceremony? I made my voice warm and interested and calm, which was the hardest performance of my life. Because underneath every question I was thinking about a man who had researched her inheritance from 2 floors above her head, for 14 months before he let her see his face. And I was thinking about what he had said on that recording. By morning, the transfer is complete and the structure is closed, and I was pressing my free hand flat against my thigh to keep it from shaking. When Emily finally said she had to go, there was a pause before she hung up, the kind of pause that means someone almost said something and then didn't. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, she stopped, then, "I'm glad you picked up." "I always pick up," I said. "I always will." After she hung up, I reached into my vest pocket and touched the velvet box that held Margaret's necklace, the one I had been carrying since the morning Emily told me not to come to the wedding. I held it in my palm for a moment without opening it. Then I put it back in my pocket, went inside, and called Harris. "We have 3 weeks," I said when he answered. "Tell me everything that needs to be in place." Harris walked me through it for the next 40 minutes. The surveillance teams, the Beverly Wilshire coordination, the Judge Okafor freeze order that was already drafted, and waiting for the moment a transaction was initiated, the 2 additional agents who would be embedded in the wedding guest list, as acquaintances of the groom. When he finished, I asked the question I had been carrying since the meeting in his office. "It's a Harris. If this goes wrong, if Daniel realizes what's happening before the transaction completes and he runs, then we arrest him on what we have," Harris said. "The Richard Collins cooperation and the recording give us enough for charges. It's a weaker case, but it's a case." A pause. "It won't go wrong, Mr. Morgan. You said you don't deal in certainties." I said I'm not certain about every variable, Harris replied. "I'm certain about this one. He's going to be there. Men like Daniel Carter don't walk away from something they've spent 4 years building. He'll be at that wedding." I thought about the restaurant in Midtown, the deep booths, the careful voice. "So will I said. I was dressed by 5:50 in the morning. The black suit had been hanging on the back of my closet door since the night before, the one Margaret had bought me for the 30th anniversary of Morgan Industrial, a celebration that felt like it belonged to a different man's life. I had taken it to the cleaner 3 days ago and picked it up yesterday and hung it there where I could see it, because I needed to remind myself that what I was doing today was not attending a wedding. It was finishing something that had started 10 years ago in a research laboratory in Riverside County, and the suit was simply what you wore when you intended to finish something properly. The velvet box went into my left breast pocket at 5:53. I pressed my palm flat against my chest for a moment, feeling the small, hard shape of it through the fabric. And then I picked up my keys and walked out of the house without eating breakfast because my stomach had been closed for business since approximately 3 a.m. The drive to Beverly Hills took 40 minutes in the pre-dawn quiet of the freeway. I parked 2 blocks from the hotel and walked the rest of the way, entering through the service entrance on the south side where Marcus Webb was waiting. Marcus was 50 years old, broad-shouldered with a face that had the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades managing other people's crises and had learned not to let them register. He had been Beverly Wilshire's head of security for 11 years, and he had received the FBI's court order requiring the hotel's cooperation 4 days ago. He had not asked questions. He had read the document, confirmed his understanding with the agent who delivered it, and sent Harris a floor plan of the entire property by end of business that same day. "Mr. Morgan," he said, extending his hand. His grip was steady and brief. "Everything is in position. I'll take you down." The security center was in the basement, a long room with low ceilings and a wall of monitors that displayed every public area of the hotel in rotating feeds. 3 of Harris's people were already there, 2 men and a woman, all in civilian clothing, all with the particular alert stillness of people doing focused work. Tom was standing by the far wall with a coffee he hadn't opened. He looked at me when I came in and gave a single nod that contained everything neither of us was going to say out loud. I took a position in front of the monitor bank and looked at the hotel, the way you look at a chessboard before a game, not searching for anything specific, yet just reading the shape of it. The Wilshire Ballroom was decorated in white and pale gold, the kind of aesthetic that costs more than most people make in a year, and is designed to look effortless. Guests were beginning to arrive on the upper floor feeds, women in silk, men in dark suits, the general choreography of a high-end wedding, moving through its pre-ceremony rituals. Florists were making final adjustments to arrangements that Emily had spent 11 minutes describing to me over the phone a month ago. I recognized the centerpieces. On a separate monitor, Emily's bridal suite. She was seated at a vanity while someone worked on her hair, and even from a camera feed, I could see that she was not the kind of still that comes from peace. She was the kind of still that comes from holding yourself together by deliberate effort. Her shoulders slightly raised her jaw, set her hands in her lap, with the fingers interlaced too tightly. She was thinking about something. I knew that posture. I had seen it the morning of the bar exam. On another monitor, Daniel. He was in the groom's suite on the opposite side of the floor, moving back and forth between the window and the door, with the energy of a man running calculations. He checked his phone 4 times in the 3 minutes I watched him. Not nerves, logistics. He was confirming that everything he had set in motion was still in motion. 2 men I didn't recognize had checked into the hotel the previous evening, one under the name of a friend of the groom, one as a guest of the venue's event coordinator. Both were now visible on the lobby feed, positioned at separate points with sightlines to the main elevator bank and the ballroom entrance. Harris's people. Camera 3, Tom said quietly, pointing to a monitor in the upper right of the bank. I looked. In a small conference room off the main corridor, Daniel was meeting with 2 men I had never seen before. He slid something across the table, a small device, matte black, about the size of a thumb drive. One of the men examined it, nodded, and put it in his jacket pocket. Northbridge, Tom said. The 2 contacts we've been tracking from New York. They flew in last night. He looked at me. They're here to receive the security key for the transaction. Once Emily signs and Daniel enters his authorization, they initiate the Cayman transfer from their end simultaneously. 3 people. 3 points of failure that Harris needed to close at the same moment. On the conference room feed, Daniel looked directly at one of the 2 men and said something I couldn't hear. The man with the device nodded again. Daniel straightened his jacket, checked his watch, and smiled the smile of a man who had just confirmed that the last variable was accounted for. My phone buzzed. A text from Vivian Santos. She just asked me what Northbridge Holdings is. Again. 3rd time this week, I told her I'd look into it. She's in the bridal suite and she has her copy of the Green Horizon contract open on her phone. I showed the message to Tom. She's still looking, he said. She doesn't have enough to stop, I said, but she has enough to ask the question. On the monitor, Emily set her phone face down on the vanity, closed her eyes for a moment, and then said something to the woman doing her hair that made the woman laugh. Emily did not laugh with her. She just picked up her phone again and kept reading. The wedding music began at 4 p.m., precisely a string quartet that I heard through the security center's audio feed, as a distant, elegant sound, the kind of music that belongs in a world where the day is exactly what it appears to be. Marcus Webb appeared at my shoulder. Ceremony beginning, he said. On the bridal suite monitor, Emily stood and turned to face the mirror. She was extraordinary, the dress, the light, all of it. She looked at her own reflection for a long moment, with an expression I recognized as the expression of a woman looking for something she wasn't sure she was going to find. Then she set her phone down on the vanity still open to the Green Horizon contract and walked toward the door. I pressed my hand against the left breast pocket of my suit. The velvet box was there, solid and small. Harris, I said quietly. He was at the other end of the room, headset on, 2 phones in front of him. He looked up. Whatever happens in that room, I said, she doesn't get hurt. Harris held my gaze for 2 full seconds. She won't, he said. On the monitor, Emily stepped into the corridor and began walking toward the sound of the music alone, her hands loose at her sides, and I watched my daughter walk toward the worst mistake of her life. And I kept my hand pressed flat against the velvet box in my pocket, and I did not move. Before I tell you what happened inside that private room, the moment everything either fell apart or fell into place, drop a "ready" in the comments. $8 million, 1 signature, and a man who had been waiting 4 years for this exact moment. Note, this story includes fictional elements woven in for clarity and impact. Names, locations, and certain details are coincidental, but the truth at its core is something worth sitting with. The ceremony took 22 minutes. I watched every second of it on a monitor in the basement of the Beverly Wilshire, standing so still that Tom put a hand on my shoulder at some point, and I barely registered it. The officiant's voice came through the audio feed as a thin, formal sound, the words of a ritual designed for a different kind of day than this one. Emily stood at the altar with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin lifted slightly. The posture she had learned from Margaret, the one that looked like composure, and was actually the architecture of someone holding themselves upright by will alone. Daniel stood across from her, looking exactly like what he had spent 4 years practicing to look like, devoted, steady. the kind of man you would be relieved your daughter had found. When the officiant said, "I do," and Emily said, "I do," back something in my chest moved in a way I had not prepared for. Not grief exactly. Something older and heavier that did not have a clean name. When Daniel kissed her, I turned and looked at the wall. Harris's voice came from across the room, quiet and even. "Stay with the feed, Mr. Morgan." I turned back. The next 11 minutes were the longest of my life. On the monitor, the guests moved toward the reception area. Daniel guided Emily, his hand at the small of her back, steering toward a private room off the main corridor. A room Marcus Webb had identified on the floor plan 3 days ago as the most likely location for the document signing. Harris moved to the primary monitor station. His team tightened around him without a word being spoken. On the feed, Daniel closed the door to the private room. He reached into his jacket and produced a document folder, setting it on the table in front of Emily, with the unhurried confidence of a man delivering good news. "I need you to read something," I heard him say through the audio feed. "The additional investors confirmed this morning. $20 million in new commitments, but they need the managing member's signature before the Asian markets open tonight." Emily took the folder. She opened it. She began to read. The room stayed quiet around me. Harris had one hand raised the signal that meant not yet. Emily flipped to the third page. Then she stopped. She looked at the document for a moment with an expression I recognized from 32 years of watching her face, the particular stillness that meant she had found something that did not match what she was expecting. Her eyes moved back up the page, rereading. "This beneficiary structure," she said carefully. "The final recipient is Northbridge Holdings. That wasn't in the original agreement." My heart stopped. Daniel did not flinch. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, with the practiced ease of a man who had prepared for exactly this question. "The new investors requested a Cayman structure for tax optimization," he said. "It's completely standard for international capital of this size. The fund attorneys added it last week." "I'm the managing member," Emily said. "I should have been notified of any changes to the beneficiary structure before today." "You're right." His voice dropped to something softer, more intimate. "And I should have walked you through it earlier. I'm sorry I wanted today to be about us, not paperwork." He squeezed her hand. "But the window is closing. If we miss the market timing, we lose the $20 million. Emily looked at the document. Then she looked at him. "Daniel!" Her voice was careful, the voice of a lawyer who had been taught never to sign something she hadn't fully read. "Why didn't you tell me about Northbridge before the wedding?" Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible, the adjustment of a man who had encountered an obstacle he had accounted for. He moved around the table and sat beside her and took both her hands in his. "Because I knew you'd question it," he said quietly. "Because your father has spent months convincing you to question everything about us. And I didn't want his voice in the room on our wedding day." He looked at her with eyes that were warm and direct and entirely rehearsed. "Do you trust me?" Emily's jaw tightened. Her throat moved as she swallowed. She picked up the pen. The monitor in front of Harris lit up the moment her signature registered a green confirmation line across the wire transfer authorization screen. Then Daniel entered his own security key, changed the beneficiary, initiated the transfer. Destination Cayman National Bank. Account ending 7741. Amount $8 million. Harris's hand dropped. "Move," he said. On the feed, Daniel's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and every carefully constructed version of himself he had ever presented to anyone dissolved in approximately 2 seconds, leaving something cold and fast and entirely without performance. He grabbed Emily's wrist, pulled her to her feet, and moved toward the door. The security center became a different room the moment Harris said move. The 2 agents by the door were already gone before the word finished leaving his mouth. Marcus Webb had his radio out and was speaking into it in a low, rapid stream elevator lockdown service exit sealed parking structure on standby. Tom was at the door. Harris was on 2 phones simultaneously, one at each ear, coordinating with the freeze order team in New York and the agents on the ballroom floor. On the monitor, Daniel was pulling Emily through the service corridor at a pace she clearly had not agreed to, her heels catching on the floor, her free hand gripping the doorframe of the private room as he dragged her past it. I was already moving. Nobody told me to stay. Harris may have said something. I heard a voice behind me that could have been his. But by the time the words would have reached me, I was in the stairwell moving up 2 floors with the floor plan Marcus had given me 3 days ago clear in my head. The service corridor connected to the kitchen level. The kitchen level connected to the staff stairwell. The staff stairwell had one exit to the parking structure and one exit to the loading dock, and both of those exits had been sealed 40 seconds ago, which meant Daniel was going to hit a wall, and the only question was where. I came through the door at the top of the stairwell, just as they appeared at the far end of the corridor. Daniel moving fast, Emily half running to keep up with him, her wedding dress, catching the fluorescent light in a way that seemed deeply wrong for a service hallway at 5 in the afternoon. Daniel saw me and stopped. The corridor was narrow. Pipes ran along the ceiling. The air smelled like kitchen exhaust and cleaning supplies. It was the least ceremonial place imaginable for a conversation 10 years in the making, and somehow that felt right. "Dad," Emily's voice came out on a breath shock and confusion, and something that might have been relief all compressed into a single syllable. Daniel's hand tightened on her wrist. His eyes moved past me to the stairwell door, calculating. "Let her go," I said. "Move out of the way, Mr. Morgan." His voice was controlled, but the ease was gone. What was left was something harder and more essential. "This doesn't have to involve you. It's already involved me for 10 years. I looked at Emily, not at him. "Come here, Emily." "Don't." Daniel stepped in front of her, positioning himself between us. "He's the reason this is happening. He's been trying to destroy this relationship since the day you told him about me. You know that." Emily looked between us. Her chest was rising and falling hard. The hand Daniel wasn't holding had gone to her collarbone, a gesture I recognized, the one she had made as a child when she was frightened and trying not to show it. "Emily," I said, "he made you sign something tonight. Ask him where the money went." "The investment fund," Daniel started. "Ask him where the $8 million went," I said. "Not Green Horizon, where it went after that." Emily turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright and wet and fierce all at once. "Daniel, where did it go? This is not the time." "Where did it go?" His jaw tightened. A muscle moved in his cheek. That was enough. Emily pulled her wrist free, a sharp, decisive movement that surprised him enough that he let go and stepped sideways toward the wall, putting 3 feet of service corridor between herself and the man she had married 4 hours ago. Stephen and Harris came through the door behind me, at that moment followed by 2 agents I didn't recognize. Harris held up his credentials. "Daniel Carter, you're under arrest." His voice was the voice of a man who had done this many times and found it neither dramatic nor casual. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit trade secret theft, document falsification, obstruction of justice. Daniel looked at Harris, then at the agents, then at Stephen, then, finally, at me. For one moment, something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. Not panic, not grief, but the particular expression of a man who has spent years inside a plan so complete that it never occurred to him to prepare for its failure. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was colder and more familiar. He turned toward the emergency exit at the far end of the corridor, drove his shoulder into it, and ran. The alarm was instantaneous, a shrieking pulse that bounced off the corridor walls and made Emily flinch hard and press herself against the wall. Harris was already on his radio. 2 agents split off through the door. Tom's voice came through Harris's earpiece loading dock. "He's going for the vehicle." 60 seconds later, Tom's voice again. "We have him." The corridor went quiet except for the fading alarm and the distant sound of guests in the ballroom, completely unaware, still celebrating something that no longer existed. I walked to where Emily was standing with her back against the wall and her hands pressed flat on the painted cinder block, on either side of her, holding herself up. She looked at me. Her eyes were dry now, past tears into something beyond them. "Dad," she said. "What just happened?" "It's over," I said. "He's not going to hurt you." From somewhere below us, the parking structure, judging by the echo, I heard Daniel Carter's voice raised for the first time since I had known him, arguing with people who were not going to be argued with. And then I heard the sound that I had waited 10 years to hear, the sound of handcuffs closing. I reached into my left breast pocket and closed my hand around the velvet box. Emily watched me do it. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, and her shoulders shook once hard. And then she straightened up and looked at me with her mother's eyes precise and clear and not finished asking questions. "You need to tell me everything," she said. "I know," I said. "Come with me." I found a bench at the end of the service corridor near a fire door that nobody was using, and Emily sat down on it in her wedding dress and looked at me with the steadiest eyes I had seen on her face all day. "Start from the beginning," she said. So I did. I told her about the Wednesday morning phone call and the photograph and the scar below his left eyebrow. I told her about Tom Baker's file, 2 years of calculated approach, the charity donation, the office 2 floors above hers, the 3 events he attended before he let her see his face. I told her about Northbridge Holdings and the 2018 incorporation date, and what Stephen had found buried in Section 9 of the Green Horizon Agreement. I told her about Rachel Thompson and the backup server, and the device identifier 7F2A, and a hotel room near Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, where her mother's life had effectively ended before anyone knew it. I told her about Richard Collins and the drive up Highway 1 and $18 million and 3 shell companies and a man who had signed paperwork approving the destruction of our family and then spent 10 years hoping someone else would fix it. Emily listened to all of it without interrupting. Her hands were in her lap, fingers interlaced, and I could see by the way the knuckles shifted that she was gripping harder as each piece landed. Then I told her about the email. In the documents Richard gave us, I said there was an email Daniel sent to a contact 4 days after your mother was first hospitalized. I kept my voice even because I needed it to stay even. It said, and I want you to know the exact words pressure is working. He'll be too distracted to fight back. Move the timeline up. Emily's breath left her body in a single sharp movement like something had struck her in the chest. Her hands came apart. She pressed one against her mouth and the other flat against her knee, and her shoulders pulled inward, and she made a sound I had never heard from her before, low and broken and entirely involuntary, the sound of something giving way. I moved to sit beside her. I did not put my arm around her because I did not know yet if she would want that, so I just sat close enough that she would know I was there. "The letter," she said finally from behind her hand. "The letter from Mom." "I knew it was forged the moment you described it," I said. "I know your mother's handwriting. I've read 50 pages of it in the last 2 months." My throat tightened around the next words. She would never have written those things. Not in her darkest hour. Not about me. Emily's hand dropped from her mouth. Her eyes were wet and bright and furious. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because if you confronted him, he would have known we were close. He would have run. And if he ran before the transaction was complete, we might never have had enough to hold him." I pressed my hand flat against my thigh. "I wanted to tell you every single day. I chose not to because I needed him to stay. And I have to live with the fact that I let you read a lie about your mother and couldn't tell you it was a lie." Emily closed her eyes. 2 tears moved down her face. Not the racked, broken crying from before, but the quiet kind that comes when grief and fury have nowhere left to go. I reached into my left breast pocket and took out the velvet box. I opened it and set it on the bench between us without saying anything. Margaret's necklace, a thin gold chain with a small diamond pendant that she had worn for 30 years and taken off only twice that I could remember. Emily looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up and held it in her palm, and her fingers closed around it so slowly and so carefully that it looked like she was afraid it might disappear. "She wanted you to have it," I said, "on a day that mattered." Emily pressed her closed fist against her mouth, and her shoulders shook once hard the way they had in the corridor, and then she straightened and reached over and took my hand and held it, and neither of us said anything for a moment that I will carry for the rest of my life. Then footsteps came down the corridor, and Vivian Santos appeared around the corner, 38 years old, dark-haired with the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally been given permission to set it down. She was holding a phone. "Miss Morgan," she said quietly, "I'm sorry to interrupt. Tom Baker asked me to bring you something." She held the phone out. "He said you should hear it." Emily took the phone, pressed play. Daniel's voice came through the speaker recorded months ago in a conversation with Richard Collins before any of us had found each other. "When Morgan goes, she's going to need someone. I just have to be patient enough." Emily listened to it twice, her jaw set. Her chin lifted her mother's posture, the architecture of someone holding themselves upright by will alone. She handed the phone back to Vivian without a word. Then she turned to me. "He planned this before Mom died," she said. "Yes," I said. She held that for a moment. Then, "Is the money safe?" Judge Okafor's freeze order activated the moment the transfer was initiated. The $8 million never left the country. She nodded once slowly, the nod of a lawyer confirming a fact. "Okay," she said, and then quietly, almost to herself, "Okay." By 9 o'clock that Saturday night, the Beverly Wilshire had become a different kind of spectacle. 3 FBI vehicles were parked in the service lane. 2 of Daniel's associates were being processed in a holding area near the loading dock. Guests who had come dressed for a celebration were standing in confused clusters in the lobby, some of them still holding champagne glasses, watching federal agents move through the ballroom with the purposeful quiet of people doing paperwork in someone else's dream. A publicist friend of Stephen's called him at 9:42 to say that cell phone footage of Daniel being escorted through the parking structure had already been uploaded to 3 separate platforms. By morning, the name Daniel Carter would be in every financial news outlet in the country, and the name Morgan Industrial would be beside it. I stayed with Emily until midnight. We sat in a hotel room Marcus Webb arranged on the 8th floor, not her bridal suite, a different room, one that didn't have flowers, and she took off her heels and sat cross-legged on the bed and asked me questions I answered as honestly as I could for 3 hours. Some of them were about Daniel, some of them were about the investigation, some of them were the kind that have no clean answers about what Margaret had known, and when, about the years they had spent in the same house without either of them saying the thing that most needed to be said about whether grief looks different when you find out the person you lost had been right about everything. Those were the ones that cost me the most to answer, and the ones I think she needed most to ask. At midnight, she said she wanted to be alone. I told her I understood and gave her the room number where I would be sleeping and told her to call me at any hour for any reason. And she nodded, and then she said something that I was not expecting. "Dad." She looked at her hands. The gold chain of Margaret's necklace was around her neck now, the diamond pendant resting at her collarbone. "Thank you for being here, even when I told you not to be." I could not speak for a moment. I pressed my lips together and nodded once and got out of the room before my face did something I would have had to apologize for. The weeks that followed were harder in some ways than the investigation. The legal machinery moved efficiently. Stephen filed the annulment petition under California Family Code, Section 22. 10 subsection D, within 48 hours of the wedding marriage obtained through fraud grounds clear and documented. The court granted it in 29 days. Emily was no longer legally married to Daniel Carter before October was over. Daniel's attorneys attempted several strategies in the weeks following the arrest. They argued Emily had signed voluntarily. They argued the Northbridge structure was standard practice. They argued that Richard Collins was a compromised witness with his own criminal exposure. Harris dismantled each argument with the recordings, the wire transfer logs, and Rachel Thompson's forensic analysis. And by November, it was clear that the only question was how long Daniel would fight before accepting the outcome. Richard Collins pled to a single count of conspiracy, accepted a cooperation agreement, and was sentenced to 5 years probation, significant financial penalties, and full restitution to Morgan Industrial. He was 71 years old and had spent a decade waiting for the thing he had done to catch up with him. When Stephen told me the sentence, I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite forgiveness, but existed somewhere between the two. Vantage Global's new ownership, eager to separate itself from the previous administration's decisions, cooperated fully with federal prosecutors. They agreed to a settlement that included substantial financial penalties, compensation to Morgan Industrial for the losses incurred during the Thermo Shield collapse, and formal relinquishment of all patents developed from the stolen data. The settlement figure, when Stephen read it to me over the phone, was north of $43 million. I asked him to repeat it anyway, not because I hadn't heard, but because I needed a moment to understand that a number I had spent 10 years trying to recover had just been returned to me in a single sentence on a Tuesday afternoon. Emily's crisis was quieter than her legal situation and considerably harder to watch. She took a leave of absence from the firm. She stopped answering most of her phone calls. She moved through the weeks in a way that suggested she was doing the necessary things, eating, sleeping, keeping her apartment orderly, but had temporarily vacated whatever part of herself made those actions feel like living. I had seen this before in Margaret during the worst months of the Thermo Shield years. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding themselves together by force of will for so long that when the crisis finally ends, the body presents the bill all at once. I did not push. I did not call more than once a week and kept the calls short about nothing important, just enough to be a voice she recognized on the other end of a phone. Every Sunday morning, I drove to her apartment in Silver Lake and left a breakfast on her doorstep. Scrambled eggs with the herbs Margaret used to use toast, cut diagonally the way she had liked since she was 7. Coffee in a thermos from the place on Sunset she had gone to every morning before the wedding. I left it with a folded note that said 4 words, "Dad is still here." I never knocked. I never waited. The 5th Sunday, I heard movement behind the door, just as I was turning to leave a sound, then a pause, then silence. I kept walking, but I drove home with something loosened slightly in my chest, and the following Sunday, I arrived 10 minutes earlier. The 6th Sunday, the door opened. Emily was wearing a sweatshirt that I recognized as one of Margaret's gray frayed. At the left cuff, the university logo cracked and faded. She looked like she had been sleeping, and then not sleeping, and had arrived somewhere past both of those things. Her eyes were clear, though, clear and tired and very direct. "The eggs are cold," she said. "I can make more," I said. She stepped back from the door, which was as close to an invitation as I was going to get, and I picked up the thermos and the paper bag and followed my daughter inside. We sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours. She made more coffee. I ate the cold eggs because I didn't want to suggest they weren't perfect. She talked about Daniel, not about what he had done, but about the smaller things, the ones that are harder to name. The way she had started to hear his voice in her own reasoning, second-guessing herself, when she knew she was right, apologizing for opinions she hadn't been wrong to hold. "He didn't tell me what to think," she said. "He just made me uncertain enough about my own judgment that I filled in the gaps with whatever he offered." "That's what they do," I said. "The careful ones." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and looked at me across the table with the expression I had been waiting 6 weeks to see, not forgiving exactly, not yet, but present, choosing to be in the room. "He told me," she said slowly, "that you cared more about the company than about us, that the Thermo Shield years proved it." She paused. "I need to know if that's true." My hands tightened on my own mug. I thought about 16-hour days and sold assets and a mortgage I had paid off 3 times over in the course of saving something that employed 1,000 people. I thought about Margaret sitting across from me at this exact kind of kitchen table, in our kitchen, saying you're going to lose her if you keep choosing the building over the family, and being right about that in ways I hadn't understood until much later. "It's complicated," I said. "There were years when I made choices I wish I'd made differently. Your mother told me so directly, and she was right." I looked at my daughter. "But I never stopped loving you, not for a single day. And the reason I fought to save that company was partly because it was the only way I knew how to fight for us." Emily looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "There's something I need to show you," I said. "When you're ready, not today, but soon." "The notebook," she said immediately. I looked at her. "You know about it. Mom mentioned it once." Her voice was careful, precise. She said she was keeping notes on things she couldn't prove. She said she hoped she was wrong. Emily's jaw tightened and then softened, and then she looked out the window at the Silver Lake morning coming through the glass. "Was she wrong?" "No," I said. "She wasn't wrong about a single thing." Emily turned back from the window. The morning light was on her face, and in it she looked young and very tired, and entirely her mother's daughter. "Okay," she said. "Show me when I'm ready." Emily came to the house on a Sunday in late November, 3 weeks after she had opened her apartment door, and let me back in. She didn't call ahead. She rang the bell at 10 in the morning, and when I opened the door, she was standing on the porch with her hands in the pockets of her coat, and the diamond pendant from Margaret's necklace resting at her collarbone, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who had made a decision on the drive over and was not going to be talked out of it. "I'm ready," she said. I led her to Margaret's reading room. The room was exactly as it had always been. Books on every wall, the lamp with the amber shade Margaret had found at an estate sale in Pasadena, the chair where she used to sit with her feet tucked under her, and a cup of tea going cold on the side table. I had not changed a thing. I had not been capable of it. I showed Emily the blue notebook first, the one I had read through in September, with the last page ending mid-sentence. She took it from me and sat in her mother's chair without being invited to, which felt entirely right, and she read every page while I stood by the window and watched the November garden and gave her whatever time she needed. When she finished, her eyes were red, but her face was composed. "She stopped in the middle of a sentence," Emily said. "I know, but there's something else." I moved to the bookshelf behind Margaret's chair. In the week after Beverly, Wilshire, when I had come back to this room to sit with Margaret the way I sometimes did when things were very hard, I had been running my hand along the back panel of the shelf, a habit reaching for something familiar when my fingers found a gap between the wood and the wall. In the gap, a second notebook, smaller than the first. dark green cover the spine, slightly worn. I had run my hand along that shelf more times than I could count in the years since Margaret died, always moving left to right, the way you move through a row of books. Emily found it differently. She had reached behind the shelf to straighten a small framed photograph that had slipped sideways the one of the three of us at her law school graduation, and her fingers had found the gap before mine ever had. I don't think Margaret hid it from me intentionally. I think she put it somewhere she knew Emily would eventually look, and I wouldn't. She had always understood us both better than we understood ourselves. I handed it to Emily. She opened it, and her breath changed immediately, a small, sharp sound, like someone stepping onto ice that holds. Margaret's handwriting covered every page, denser and more urgent than the blue notebook, written across several months in the year before she died. She had continued where the blue notebook had left off, and then gone further, specific dates, specific conversations she had overheard, a phone number she had found in Daniel's handwriting during a company event that she had cross-referenced months later against the Delaware registration of Meridian Advisory Group. She had been building a case the same way I had, in secret, alone without anyone to tell. On the last page, she had finished what she was saying. Not a trailing thought, not a sentence broken off, a complete paragraph written in the careful hand of someone who understood she was running out of time. Emily read it without speaking. Her lips moved slightly on certain words. When she reached the end, she pressed the notebook against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something precious that you are afraid might disappear, and her shoulders lifted and fell, once with a breath so deep it became a sound. She handed the notebook to me. I read the last paragraph. Leorin will not see this in time to be helped by it, and I have accepted that. But Emily will find it eventually, because Emily is smarter and more patient than either of us, and she will find her way to the truth, the way she has always found her way to the truth, by refusing to stop asking questions. I am not frightened. I am only sorry that I will not be here to see it. Take care of each other. That is the whole of it. That is everything I have to say. My throat closed. I pressed my fist against my mouth and stared at the words until they blurred and then steadied and then blurred again. Emily rose from the chair and put her arms around me from the side, the way she had when she was small, and I was upset about something she didn't fully understand but knew required her presence. I put my hand over her forearm and held it, and we stood in Margaret's reading room in the November light without trying to make it into anything other than what it was. After a while, she said quietly against my shoulder, "She was right. I found my way." "She was always right," I said. "I was just slow to catch up." The months that followed moved the way months do after something large has been resolved, not easily, but with the forward momentum of people who have decided to keep going. In May of 2025, Daniel Carter received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison on 5 counts: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit trade, secret theft, document falsification, and obstruction of justice. The sentencing judge noted that the crimes had spanned more than a decade and caused material harm to people who had never been named in any indictment. Daniel showed no emotion when the sentence was read. I watched the proceedings on a live stream with Stephen beside me and Tom standing in the doorway. When the camera cut away, Stephen removed his glasses and cleaned them. Tom walked out and came back 30 seconds later with 3 cups of coffee. Some people expressed themselves efficiently. I called Emily immediately. She answered on the first ring. "I know," she said before I could speak. "I know you know," I said. "Are you okay?" I considered it honestly. "Yes," I said. "I think I actually am." In August, Morgan Industrial launched the refined Thermo Shield, rebuilt from Rachel Thompson's recovered formula, data tested for 18 months under independent scientific oversight, brought to market under a transparency protocol Emily had helped design. The first week of sales exceeded projections for the entire first quarter. I directed a portion of the initial revenue to a support fund for the 847 employees who had lost their jobs a decade earlier, and another portion to a legal aid initiative for small businesses harmed by intellectual property theft. It was not restitution. Nothing could fully be that, but it was the closest available. In October, we held the 40th anniversary celebration in the original warehouse in Riverside County, the same floor, the same high ceilings now hung with photographs from every decade. Emily stood beside me when I spoke. She had not told me she was going to say anything, but when I finished, she stepped forward and said in the clear and certain voice she used when she had no doubt, "A business is built on trust, Not the absence of doubt, but the choice to remain honest when dishonesty would be easier. My father has made that choice for 40 years. That is what I want to carry forward. After the room began to clear, Emily found me by the early photographs. 6 workers, 2 machines, a man in his mid-20s who looked completely certain about something he had no right yet to be certain about. She reached into her bag and produced the dark green notebook. She had put it in a framed, simple glass front, the kind that sits on a desk. "She belongs in your office," Emily said, "so she can watch what happens next." I took it from her with both hands. Through the glass in the last paragraph Margaret had ever written about any of this, the final sentence read, "Take care of each other." That is the whole of it. "She would have loved to see this," I said. Emily put her hand through my arm and leaned her head against my shoulder. "She does," she said. "I'm sure of it. Looking back at this family story, I keep asking myself, what did I almost lose by staying silent too long? 10 years, my daughter, everything Margaret and I built together. Don't be like me. Don't wait for perfect evidence before you speak. Don't protect the people you love by keeping them in the dark. That silence is exactly the space that predators need. When someone warns you about danger, listen with your whole heart, not just the part that wants everything to be fine. This family betrayal taught me something I wish I had learned sooner. Love without honesty is a door left unlocked. God places people in our lives who see what we cannot. Margaret saw, it wrote it down, and trusted that truth would find its way out. It always does. My personal view, the most dangerous lies are the ones delivered by someone holding your hand. Every family story deserves the truth, even when it arrives late. This family betrayal doesn't only happen in boardrooms, it happens quietly to people who trusted completely and questioned too late. Don't let that be you. If this family story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a thought in the comments I read, everyone. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and education. If that's not for you today, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you best.